1957. 6 capos stood frozen around a coffin no one dared touch. The lid slammed open a living man. A running recorder, orders that humiliated the most powerful boss in New York. Bumpy Johnson never fired a single shot. To see how Bumpy Johnson turned a death sentence into a throne, we go back to the night Harlem never forgot. Brooklyn, 3 a.m. The phone rang like something was already dead. Joey Caruso knocked over an ashtray, grabbing the receiver. Cigarette butts scattered across the floor. His sister's voice came through the line, broken and wet. Barely human. He had to press the phone so hard against his ear it left a red mark on his skin just to understand what she was saying. Maria, his daughter. Bone marrow failure. $60,000. 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, the doctors said, her body would begin destroying itself from the inside out. Her organs would shut down one by one like lights going off in an empty building. Joey sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. He didn't move for 11 minutes. He counted every single one of them in his head because counting was the only thing keeping him from putting his fist through the plaster. He had $11,000 in a shoebox under the floorboards. Money he had earned doing things that would have put him in prison for the rest of his life. $11,000 stacked in rubber-banded bundles, smelling like motor oil and old leather, against $60,000 in 6 weeks, with a 14-year-old girl in room 4, 1-2 of Kings County Hospital, who weighed 84 pounds and couldn't keep a glass of water down without her body rejecting it. He started making calls before the sun came up. He called Sal Benedetti first, a man he had helped move stolen car parts across 3 state lines without a single question asked. Sal picked up on the second ring, listened for 30 seconds without interrupting, then said, "Joey, I love you like a brother, but I don't put money into hospitals. You know how this works. I'm sorry about the girl." The line clicked dead before Joey could say another word. He called 7 more men after that, men he had bled for, men he had kept his mouth shut for when keeping his mouth shut was the most dangerous thing he could have done. Every single one of them said no. Not because they didn't have the money. Every one of those men had more cash hidden in their walls than most banks held in their vaults. They said no because in Joey's world, nobody finances hope. Hope doesn't pay you back. Hope doesn't show up at a man's door and break 3 fingers when the payment is late. Hope is worthless, and in that world, worthless things get left to die. 9 men, 9 doors slammed in the face of a father trying to keep his daughter alive, in a neighborhood where everything got forgotten on purpose. That kind of silence had a way of outlasting the men who created it. By 6 in the morning, Joey had been refused 9 times. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood at the kitchen window watching Brooklyn wake up. A garbage truck groaned down the street below. A dog barked twice and went quiet. The sky turned from black to the color of a bruise. He thought about Maria's bedroom. On the wall above her desk she had taped a drawing she made in 3rd grade. A purple horse with a crooked smile and uneven legs and a sun in the corner drawn with a yellow crayon pressed so hard it had torn through the paper slightly. Joey had walked past that drawing every morning for 6 years without ever stopping to really look at it. He looked at it now. He stood in his kitchen with a glass of whiskey in his hand and stared at that drawing until his eyes burned. Then he heard the car outside. A black Cadillac DeVille rolled to a stop directly in front of his building. No one on the street paid it any attention, which told Joey immediately that this car had been expected by everyone except him. The engine cut off. The car just sat there on the empty street, long and black and perfectly still, like a coffin someone had left at the curb. He watched from the window for 3 full minutes without moving. Then the passenger door opened. A heavy man in a gray suit stepped out onto the sidewalk. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the particular kind of calm that belongs only to men who have not been afraid of anything in a very long time. He looked directly up at Joey's window without hesitating. without searching. He already knew exactly which floor, exactly which window, exactly which desperate and hollowed-out face would be staring back down at him. The man didn't wave. He didn't call out. He nodded once. Slow. Final. The way you nod at something that has already been decided. Joey set his whiskey glass down on the windowsill without drinking it. Downstairs. The man in the gray suit said 4 words. The Don wants to meet. Joey didn't ask which Don. Every man who had lived the life Joey lived for the past 15 years already knew the answer to that question, the same way he knew how to breathe automatically, instinctively, without having to think about it at all. He grabbed his coat off the hook by the door. He did not wake his wife. He did not write a note. He walked out of that apartment and got into the back of the Cadillac, and as it pulled away from the curb, he watched his building shrink in the rear window until it disappeared completely behind the corner. 9 men had told him no. He had gone looking for money in every direction available to a man like him, and every door had stayed locked. Now the money had come to find him, and somewhere underneath the relief of that, in a place Joey was trying very hard not to look directly at, he already understood what that meant. Men like Genovese don't bring money to your door out of kindness. They bring it because they've already calculated your desperation down to the last dollar. And they've already decided exactly what they're going to ask you to do with it when the clock runs out. A man doesn't have choices anymore. He only has a price left to pay. Little Italy at 7 in the morning smelled like bread and cigarettes, and something older underneath both of those things. Something that had soaked into the walls of these buildings over decades and couldn't be scrubbed out no matter how many times you tried. The Cadillac stopped in front of a narrow building with green shutters and no sign outside. The man in the gray suit opened Joey's door without a word and gestured toward the entrance. Joey straightened his coat, pulled one slow breath through his nose, and walked through the door into a room that smelled so thickly of cigar smoke it pressed against his face like a hand. Vito Genovese was already seated at the far end of a long table when Joey walked in. He was 60 years old, compact, dressed in a dark suit with a white pocket square folded so precisely it looked like it had been pressed into place with a machine. A cigar burned slowly in an ashtray to his left, sending a thin ribbon of smoke straight up toward the ceiling without wavering. Genovese did not stand. He did not extend his hand. He looked at Joey the way a surgeon looks at something that needs to be cut, with complete focus and absolutely no feeling behind it. 2 men stood against the wall behind him. They didn't look at Joey. They looked at the door, the window, the corners of the room. That was worse than if they'd been staring directly at him. Men who watch the exits instead of the person in the room are men who are already prepared for something to go badly wrong, and they intend to be the ones still standing when it does. "Sit down, Joey," Genovese said. His voice was barely above a murmur, the kind of quiet that forces the person listening to lean forward slightly. And the moment you lean forward, you've already surrendered something, without realizing it. Joey sat down. "Your daughter's name is Maria," Genovese said, picking up his cigar and turning it slowly between 2 fingers. "She's in room 412 at Kings County. Bone marrow failure. The surgery costs $60,000 and must happen within 6 weeks, or the damage becomes permanent. You have $11,000 in a shoebox under the floorboards of your bedroom. And every man you called this morning told you no." The air in the room got heavier. Joey's hands were flat on the table in front of him, and he forced himself to keep them perfectly still. "You've had someone watching me," Joey said. "I have someone watching everyone," Genovese replied, setting the cigar back in the ashtray with a small, precise movement. "That is the only reason I'm still sitting at this table instead of in the ground with the men who sat here before me." He said it the way a man states the weather, flat, certain, like violence was simply a condition of the atmosphere in rooms like this one. and everyone present had accepted that long before they ever walked through the door. Genovese folded his hands together on the table. His knuckles were scarred, old scars layered over older ones. His eyes were completely flat, like two stones sitting at the bottom of a cold river that hadn't moved in years. "Kill Bumpy Johnson," he said. "Your daughter lives." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Joey heard the cigar burning. He heard his own pulse moving through his ears. He heard one of the men behind Genovese shift his weight slightly on the floorboards, and the sound was extraordinarily loud in the silence that surrounded it. 30,000 up front, Genovese continued in the same quiet, unhurried voice, as if he were reading from a document he had already reviewed many times before. Enough to cover the full cost of the surgery with money left over. The remaining 30 when the job is finished. One man, Joey. One man against your daughter's life. That is the entire transaction. An envelope appeared on the table. Joey had not seen anyone place it there. It was simply there suddenly, white and thick, sitting directly in front of him like a verdict handed down by a court he had never been allowed to address. He stared at it. He thought about 84 pounds. He thought about a purple horse with a crooked smile. He thought about a 14-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed who had never done a single wrong thing in her entire short life, who still had everything waiting for her if her father could just find a way to keep her alive long enough to reach it. He reached out and picked up the envelope. Rooms like that one had a habit of producing the same story, told years later by different men with the same look in their eyes. The moment his fingers closed around it, something shifted behind Genovese's eyes. A brief, cold flash of satisfaction. There and gone in less than half a second. Because Genovese had done this exact thing before, in this exact room, with different desperate men sitting in that same chair. He knew precisely what that moment meant. When a broken man picks up the money, the transaction is complete. There is no giving it back. There is no walking away and pretending the meeting never happened. The debt now runs in only one direction, and it will keep running until the man either delivers what was promised or gets put in the ground for failing to do so. Joey walked out of that room with $30,000 in his coat and a contract to kill the most powerful man in Harlem. He told himself he had no choice. He told himself any father would have done exactly the same thing. He was probably right, and not one part of that changed what was already moving toward him like a freight train on a track with no curves. A boss never needs to threaten. He only needs to place on the table the one thing a broken man cannot walk away from. Joey started watching Bumpy Johnson on a Tuesday morning, and he was completely, dangerously certain that nobody in Harlem noticed him at all. He was wrong before he ever stepped off the train. He came up out of the 125th Street station at 8 a.m., with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, moving the way men move when they're trying hard not to be seen, which is the surest possible way to be seen immediately. He walked 3 blocks east, bought a cup of coffee from a street cart, and positioned himself near the entrance of a hardware store with a clear view of the barbershop on Lenox Avenue where Bumpy Johnson arrived every Tuesday and Thursday between 8:30 and 9. He stood there feeling invisible. He was not invisible. He was the most visible man on that entire block. A 12-year-old boy named Calvin had clocked Joey Caruso within 40 seconds of him coming up out of that subway entrance. Calvin shined shoes outside the Apollo Theater 6 days a week, which meant he knew every face in a 6-block radius the way a doctor knows a patient's chart completely, precisely, without any hesitation. Joey Caruso's face did not belong anywhere in that chart. Calvin watched him for 8 straight minutes, memorized his coat, his build, the specific way he kept his right hand buried deep in his pocket while his left hand held the coffee cup. Then Calvin walked 2 blocks south and knocked on a specific door. Harlem in 1957 didn't miss a thing. It just chose carefully what it decided to remember. By noon, Illinois Gordon had a written physical description of Joey sitting on a table in front of him. By 2 in the afternoon, they had Joey's full name. By 4, they had his complete history, the crews he had run with, the jobs he had touched, the dying daughter in the Brooklyn hospital, and the $49,000 he was still short of saving her life. Bumpy Johnson received all of it that evening over dinner, delivered in a folded note placed quietly beside his water glass. He read it once, folded it back closed, and set it down without changing a single thing about his expression. He finished his meal. He wiped his mouth carefully with his napkin. Then he said to Illinois Gordon, who was seated 2 tables away, "Don't touch him. Don't follow him in a way he can feel. Don't do a single thing that tells him we've seen him, because the moment he knows we've seen him, whoever sent him sends someone else and we lose the thread entirely. I want to know who put a man with a dying daughter on a train to Harlem to do their killing for them. Because that tells me exactly how frightened of me they really are." Gordon asked what they should do if Joey made a move before they had the full picture. "He won't," Bumpy said, and his voice carried the flat certainty of a man who has spent decades reading desperate people down to their bones. "Look at how he stands on that corner. Look at where his eyes go when he thinks nobody is watching. That man is not operating from anger. He is operating from terror. And men who are terrified do not move fast. They stand on street corners telling themselves tomorrow is the right day. And then tomorrow arrives, and they tell themselves the exact same thing all over again. He will watch for 2 full weeks before he does anything. We have time." He was right to the day. Joey watched for 14 days without pulling a trigger. He mapped every route Bumpy traveled. He identified 3 separate positions with clean sightlines and clear exit paths. He reviewed his notes every night in a rented room in Washington Heights and told himself he was being careful. Told himself preparation and readiness were the same thing. Told himself he was almost ready. Every morning he went back to Harlem and stood in a different position and watched and waited and did not move. And every single day, Calvin and 2 other boys rotated quietly through the neighborhood around him, filing reports that Gordon assembled into a portrait so detailed and precise it included the brand of cigarettes Joey smoked and the exact bench in St. Nicholas Park where he sat and ate his lunch and stared at nothing. When Gordon finally confirmed that the money and the order behind Joey Caruso had come directly from Vito Genovese, Bumpy set his glass down very slowly and said nothing for a long time. The silence in the room was the kind that makes every other person present instinctively go still. The way animals go still when they sense something large and dangerous moving nearby in the dark. "Genovese," Bumpy said finally, and the name came out of his mouth the way you say something you have been expecting for a long time and are not remotely surprised to finally hear. "He couldn't come at me directly, so he found a man with nothing left and pointed him at me like a loaded gun. That is not power. That is panic, wearing an expensive suit." He stood up from his chair and buttoned his jacket with slow, deliberate fingers. "I don't want a grave dug," he said. "I want a coffin built. Good wood, brass handles. The kind of coffin you send to a man when you want him to understand clearly that you could have put him inside it at any moment you chose and simply decided not to." Gordon stared at him. "You want to seal the hitman inside it and ship him back to Little Italy alive. I want to send Genovese something he cannot ignore, cannot explain to his own people, and cannot recover from politically." Bumpy said, "A dead body is just a body. Men in this business have seen dead bodies their entire lives. They are not frightened by dead bodies. But a living man climbing out of a coffin in the middle of your own meeting room with a recording device running that is not a body, that is the complete and total destruction of a man's authority in front of the exact people whose loyalty is the only thing keeping him breathing." He walked to the window and looked out at 7th Avenue below. His street, his neighborhood, the one he had fought for and bled for and gone to prison for, the one that had been his before Genovese ever thought to reach a hand into it, and that would remain his long after Genovese became nothing but a name people mention quietly to explain what happens when a man's reach grows longer than his judgment. Real power, Bumpy said quietly, still looking out at the street, is not knowing your enemy is coming for you. Every man with enemies knows they are coming. Real power is knowing exactly which second your enemy is going to lose his nerve and already being 3 moves past that moment before he has even decided to act. Joey got the call on a Wednesday night. His sister's voice came through the receiver like something drowning. Maria's fever had spiked to 104. The doctors needed more money to maintain her pain medication, or they would reduce the dosage. She would feel everything they were doing to her body, every needle, every procedure, every hour. Joey called the number Genovese had given him before his sister had even finished talking. The phone rang 4 times. A man answered. Joey kept his voice steady and professional and explained the situation in as few words as possible. $2,000. Just enough to keep Maria's medication stable for 10 more days while he finished the job. That was all he was asking for. The man on the other end listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Mr. Genovese doesn't advance payments against incomplete work. The arrangement was clear from the beginning. You deliver the result. You collect the remainder. That is the deal you shook hands on." Joey pressed harder. "I'm not asking for the back half. I'm asking for $2,000 to keep a 14-year-old girl out of agony for 10 days while I finish what I was hired to do. $2,000 against a job worth $60,000. That is nothing." There was a pause on the line, long enough to feel deliberate. Then the man said, very quietly, very carefully, "Mr. Genovese asked me to mention that hospital supply chains can be unpredictable. Medications go missing. It would be a genuine shame if a young girl's treatment was interrupted at such a delicate stage in her recovery." The line went dead. Men who operated at that level never left threats in writing, but the pattern they left behind was always identical. And everyone who survived it remembered every word. Joey stood in the phone booth on the corner of Atlantic Avenue with the dead receiver pressed against his chest and the smell of exhaust and cold concrete filling his lungs. A bus groaned past. A kid on a bicycle cut between 2 parked cars. The world kept moving with complete indifference to the fact that a man had just threatened to let a child suffer in order to keep her father pointed in the right direction. He walked back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He lit a cigarette and smoked it down to the filter without tasting it. Then he lit another one and did the same thing. 4 cigarettes in a row, lining the dead butts up on the windowsill in a neat row without being aware he was doing it. He thought about the room in Little Italy, the cigar smoke pressing against his face like a hand, the envelope appearing on the table as if it had materialized out of the air. Genovese sitting there with his scarred hands folded and his flat Riverstone eyes knowing everything the hospital. The room number, the shoebox, every phone call Joey had made before the sun came up that morning. He had known all of it before Joey walked through the door, which meant he hadn't been offering a solution. He had been offering a cage. He had found a desperate man. Watched that desperation carefully. Let it ripen to exactly the right point. And then walked up and locked the door from the outside. And now Joey saw the rest of it, the part he had been refusing to look at directly for 3 weeks. Even if he put a bullet in Bumpy Johnson, he was never walking away from this. Genovese didn't reward men who had sat in that room and heard those words and touched that envelope. He buried them, quietly, in ways that left no paperwork and attracted no attention. Joey wasn't an employee. He was a loose end that hadn't been tied off yet. The moment the job was done, Genovese's men would find Joey in a stairwell or an alley or a parking structure, and whatever they did to him would be fast and efficient and completely untraceable. And then, because dead men sometimes had families who asked inconvenient questions to inconvenient people, they would deal with his wife, his sister, anyone who might someday sit across a table from a man with a badge and say a name that connected to a night that needed to stay buried forever. He had not been hired to win. He had been hired to disappear. Joey sat in that room for 2 hours without moving. The radiator knocked against the wall like something trapped inside it trying to get out. A bottle shattered somewhere down in the alley below his window. The street ran its usual sounds up through the wall's engines. Voices, a door slamming hard enough to shake the glass in its frame 2 floors up. He picked up the phone and called Richie DeLuca, childhood friend, delivery driver out of a Bronx warehouse, a man who still knew people in places Joey now desperately needed access to. Joey asked one question. Richie called back 40 minutes later with an address and a time written in his voice like something he wanted off his hands as fast as possible. Joey wrote them on the inside of a matchbook. He pressed his hand flat against his coat pocket from the outside and held it there. Some guns don't fire bullets. They fire the truth instead. And when the truth finally hits you in a room that smells like dead cigarettes and radiator heat, the wound it leaves doesn't bleed on the outside at all. 11:32 p.m. Joey pushed through the front door of the restaurant on 7th Avenue and the Jazz. Stopped like someone had cut a wire. Not slowly, not one instrument trailing off after another. All 3 players stopped between one beat and the next trumpet mid-phrase. Bass bow lifted an inch off the strings, pianist's hands hovering above the keys without touching them. The silence that followed was so sudden and so total it had physical weight. It pressed against Joey's eardrums the way silence only does when every person in a room has simultaneously decided to stop breathing and wait. Joey's right hand was already inside his coat before the door swung shut behind him. The woman at the bar reached for her glass and her fingers missed it completely, and it dropped and exploded against the tile floor in a sound like a gunshot in a small room. Nobody looked at it. Nobody looked at anything except the careful, deliberate middle distance that people with experience look at when they are rapidly calculating the geometry of a dangerous situation and determining which direction puts the most solid objects between themselves and whatever is about to happen. Joey scanned the room. Corner table, empty. Bumpy Johnson's chair facing the door sat vacant, and the wrongness of that landed in Joey's stomach like a fist, because he had watched that man sit in that exact chair 3 times in the past 2 weeks, and it had never once been empty at this hour on this night. He was still scanning when the voice arrived from directly behind him, close enough that Joey could feel the breath against the back of his neck. "Take your hand off the gun," Bumpy Johnson said. 2 fingers, nice and slow. Set it on the bar and step away from it. Then you and I are going to sit down at that table and have a conversation like 2 men who both still have a chance to walk out of here tonight with their hearts still beating. Joey's fingers tightened around the grip inside his coat, every muscle locked. He stood there doing the mathematics of a room he had walked into completely wrong, and the mathematics were not complicated, and they had only one answer, and it took him 4 full seconds of dead silence to accept it. "I have had a gun pressed against your spine since your hand touched the door handle outside," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the flat, almost gentle tone of a man explaining something to someone who is taking too long to understand it. 2 more men are behind you to your left, 1 at the bar to your right. You walked into this room already finished. The only thing still open right now is whether that changes." Joey took his hand out of his coat. He placed the revolver on the bar with 2 fingers. He stepped back from it. Bumpy came around to face him, and Joey saw him clearly for the first time at close range. 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, dark suit, gray tie, hands loose and open at his sides. His face held the specific expression of a man who had already concluded this conversation before it started and was waiting with mild patience for the other person to arrive at the same place. "Sit down," Bumpy said. They sat across from each other at the corner table. One of Bumpy's men materialized from somewhere Joey had not been watching and set a brown folder on the table between them without a word. Bumpy rested 2 fingers on top of it and looked at Joey with eyes that did not move. "Maria Catherine Caruso," Bumpy said. 14 years old. Room 412, Kings County Hospital. Bone marrow failure. 3 weeks ago, Genovese threatened to cut her pain medication through a phone call made to a booth on Atlantic Avenue at 9:47 in the evening. Nobody who sat at that table ever walked away questioning whether Bumpy Johnson had already read the last page before anyone else had opened the book. Joey's jaw tightened until he could feel it in his back teeth. "I've known about your daughter since the second morning you stood on that corner watching my barber shop." Bumpy continued. "I've known about the shoebox under your floorboards, about every call you made before sunrise, about the phone booth on Atlantic Avenue, and exactly what was said to you on that call word for word. The folder was full of documents, hospital intake forms, treatment schedules, financial records showing the exact gap between what the surgery cost and what Joey had. Everything assembled with the kind of completeness that made Joey's chest go hollow. Because it meant that every single thing he thought he had been keeping private had been an open book to the man he had come here tonight to kill. "You came here to put a bullet in me," Bumpy said, "because you finally understood that Genovese was going to bury you and your family whether you finished the job or not. And you decided that if you were going to die either way, you might as well go down doing the one thing that still had any chance of keeping your daughter alive." Joey said nothing. Every word of it was accurate and sitting between them on the table like something that couldn't be picked up and put away. Bumpy leaned forward and folded his scarred hands on the table in front of him. His voice dropped just enough to mean something. "I am not going to kill you, Joey. I am going to do something that is going to take you a minute to believe is real." The pause lasted exactly long enough. "I am going to help you." When a man has every reason to pull the trigger and instead pulls up a chair, the fight was already over before you walked through the door. Joey sat across from Bumpy Johnson in that corner booth and the jazz had started again behind them. Slow, low, a trumpet working through something mournful that fit the room exactly. The shattered glass behind the bar had been swept away without anyone being asked. The other customers had returned to their drinks and their conversations. The room looked almost peaceful, which Joey now understood was something that got constructed on purpose in places like this and maintained through a kind of collective discipline that most people never had to think about. "You're going to pay for my daughter's surgery," Joey said. The words came out careful and flat, the way a man speaks when he is repeating something back to make sure he heard it right and still cannot entirely believe that he did. "Every dollar," Bumpy said. "Surgery, recovery, whatever she needs after, paid directly to the hospital, so there is no confusion about where it comes from and no strings attached to any of it." Joey looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "And what do you want in return?" Bumpy picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at Joey steadily over the rim of it. "I want you to deliver something to Vito Genovese. Not a letter, not a warning he can fold up and handle quietly on his own terms. Something that walks through his door and sits down in the middle of his meeting room and plays itself out loud in front of every man whose opinion of him is the only thing keeping him alive." "What kind of something?" Joey said. "A coffin," Bumpy said, "with you inside it." The trumpet held a long, low note behind them. A glass clinked at the bar. Joey sat completely still. "Good wood," Bumpy continued, setting his coffee down with a quiet, precise movement. "Brass handles, the kind that announces itself before anyone touches it. We put you inside with a recording device running. The device plays Genovese's own voice giving the order his exact words. recorded in his own room, instructing his men to kill you and your entire family the moment the job on me was finished. His voice, in a coffin, delivered to his own captains, in a room full of men who are about to hear exactly what their boss planned to do to the man he used to get what he wanted. Joey leaned forward slowly. "Where did you get a recording of Genovese ordering my family killed?" "The same place I got everything else," Bumpy said simply. "Harlem pays attention. The recording has never been produced in any courtroom, but the silence it created that night spoke loudly enough for every man in the room to hear it for the rest of his life." Joey looked down at the table. He thought about the envelope in that smoke-filled room in Little Italy, the way it appeared on the table without anyone placing it there. Genovese's flat eyes watching Joey's hand close around $30,000 with that brief, cold flash of satisfaction that lasted less than half a second, but that Joey had been seeing every time he closed his eyes for 3 weeks. He thought about a voice on a telephone telling him that medications went missing and supply chains had gaps, and it would be a genuine shame. "If this goes wrong," Joey said quietly, "he kills all of us. Me, my wife, my sister, Maria in her hospital bed before she's even strong enough to sit up. If you do nothing," Bumpy said, "he kills all of you regardless. The only difference between those two outcomes is whether you gave yourself a fighting chance before the end." Joey pressed his palms flat on the table. The wood was cool and solid under his hands. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me one single thing. I came in here tonight with a loaded gun pointed at your life." Bumpy was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, there was no performance in it and no softness either. Just the direct, level voice of a man saying exactly what he meant. "Because Genovese went looking for the most broken man he could find and aimed him at me like a weapon. And that tells me everything I need to know about what kind of operation he's running. And because your daughter is 14 years old and she has not done one single wrong thing to anyone in this entire story, and she deserves better than dying in a hospital bed because her father got used by a coward." He stood up from the table and buttoned his jacket with slow, deliberate fingers. 4 days. Get some sleep. You are going to need steady hands when that lid comes open." He walked away through the restaurant without looking back. No urgency, no performance, just a man moving through a room that had always been his, toward a conclusion he had already made his peace with long before tonight. Joey sat alone at the corner table. He looked at Maria's hospital records spread in the folder in front of him. He looked at Bumpy's empty coffee cup. He looked at his own hands flat on the table and thought about everything those hands had done to get to this moment and everything they were about to do to get out of it. Violence marks people through fear and leaves its impression through pain. But mercy, real mercy, offered without hesitation by a man who had every weapon and every reason to choose otherwise, that leaves a mark that goes all the way through. The kind a man carries in his chest for the rest of his life like a coal that never goes fully cold, no matter how many years he puts between himself and the night it was placed there. The coffin arrived at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. 4 men carried it through the back entrance of the building on Mulberry Street, setting it down in the center of the meeting room floor with a sound that traveled up through the floorboards and into the feet of every man standing in that room. Good wood, brass handles that caught the light from the single overhead bulb and threw it back in small, hard flashes. It was the kind of coffin that cost real money. And everyone in that room understood immediately that whoever had sent it had wanted them to know that. 6 capos stood around it in a loose circle. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward it. The room smelled like cigar smoke and floor wax and the particular kind of tension that fills a space when experienced men suddenly cannot read a situation and cannot afford to show that they cannot read it. Genovese stood at the head of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the coffin with an expression that gave away nothing. But his jaw was tight. The men closest to him could see that. And in a room full of men who had spent their entire adult lives reading the faces of dangerous people, A tight jaw on Vito Genovese meant something that nobody wanted to be standing too close to when it broke open. "Open it," Genovese said. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Tommy Ricci, the youngest capo in the room, 29 years old and still carrying the particular recklessness of a man who had not yet been afraid enough times to fully respect fear, stepped forward and reached for the lid. The lid swung open and Joey Caruso sat up out of that coffin like something returning from the dead. Several men stepped back in pure reflex. One knocked his chair into the wall behind him. The sound cracked through the silence like a bat hitting bone. Joey's face was pale and sheened with sweat from 2 hours in that box. But his eyes were open and steady, and his right hand was pressed flat against the recording device taped to the inside of the coffin wall. He reached over and pressed play. Genovese's voice filled the room. Unmistakable. Recorded clearly. Every word precise and deliberate. The voice gave the order to eliminate Joey Caruso and his entire family the moment the job on Bumpy Johnson was completed. It gave the order calmly, professionally, the way a man gives an order he has given many times before and expects to be carried out without discussion. The recording lasted 47 seconds. When it ended, the room was so quiet Joey could hear the breathing of the man standing nearest to him. Nobody looked at Joey. Every man in that room was looking at Genovese. Genovese's face had changed. Not dramatically. Not the way a guilty man's face changes in a movie. Just a tightening around the eyes and a stillness in the body that communicated very clearly to every experienced man in that room that they were looking at a person who had just lost something he was never going to recover. Then Carlo Messina, 53 years old, 22 years as a capo, a man who had survived 4 internal purges through a combination of patience and absolute ruthlessness, reached inside his jacket and pulled out a revolver. He did not point it at Joey. He pointed it at a man named Frank Villardo who was standing 2 feet to his left, and he shot Frank Villardo once through the chest at point-blank range. Villardo hit the floor and the room exploded. 2 men drew weapons. Someone overturned the table. A lamp shattered against the far wall and the room dropped into partial darkness cut only by the overhead bulb swinging on its cord from the impact. Shouting. Movement. The sound of a second shot from somewhere Joey could not identify. Joey was already over the side of the coffin and moving toward the back door before Villardo's body stopped sliding across the floor. Every man in that room told a different version of what happened next. Some said 3 shots were fired. Some said 5. Some said Genovese walked out under his own power. Some said he was escorted. The details shifted depending on who was doing the telling and how much they needed to protect themselves from what they had witnessed. But not one of them ever disputed the outcome. Not one of them ever claimed that Vito Genovese walked out of that room with the same authority he had carried into it. When a boss gets exposed in front of his own men, he doesn't lose a battle. He loses the only thing that was ever keeping him in power. 3 days after the coffin, the commission met. Not in a restaurant, not in a social club, in the back room of a dry cleaning business in Queens that had been used for sensitive conversations for 11 years because the owner had been smart enough to never ask questions and never keep records. 7 men. 1 table, no food, no drinks. The kind of meeting where pleasantries are understood by everyone present to be a waste of time that nobody has. The problem on the table was Harlem. Specifically, the problem was what Vito Genovese had done in Harlem and what it had produced and what it was now going to cost the organization if someone didn't make a decision that stuck. Albert Anastasia spoke first. He laid it out without editorializing. Genovese had moved against Bumpy Johnson's territory without commission approval. He had recruited an outside contractor using methods that had now been recorded and played back in a room full of witnesses. He had created a situation that was generating attention from people whose attention was the single most expensive thing any of them could afford right now. The feds are already sniffing around the Mulberry Street location. Anastasia said. That recording exists. Copies of it may exist. Every man who was in that room is now a potential problem depending on how this gets handled. Frank Costello leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. How much is Harlem generating annually under Johnson's current operation? The number that came back across the table was substantial, consistent, had been consistent for years. Bumpy Johnson ran Harlem the way a careful man runs a business, not with maximum aggression, but with enough control to keep the revenue steady and the disruptions minimal. Under Genovese's proposed arrangement, that revenue stream would have been absorbed, but the disruption required to absorb it would have cost more than the absorption was worth. Genovese wanted the territory, Costello said, but the territory's already working. You don't burn down a building that's generating rent. Nobody disagreed with that. The commission did not operate on sentiment. It operated on arithmetic, and the arithmetic of Harlem in 1957 was straightforward. Bumpy Johnson's operation was producing money reliably. Genovese's intervention had produced chaos expensively, and chaos was the one thing none of them could afford in a year when federal scrutiny was tightening around every operation from Brooklyn to Chicago. The vote was not close. Harlem would remain under Bumpy Johnson's control. Genovese would withdraw any claim to the territory and any personnel currently positioned within it. The matter of the recording and the witnesses would be handled through the usual channels, which meant quietly and permanently and in ways that would not generate additional problems. Genovese sat at the end of the table and said nothing during the vote. He accepted the result without visible reaction, which every man present understood was not acceptance at all. It was the face a man puts on when he is calculating his next move and needs time that he cannot afford to appear to be buying. What nobody at that table said out loud, but every man present understood with complete clarity, was that Genovese had not just lost a territory dispute. He had demonstrated that he was capable of making decisions that endangered the entire organization for the sake of personal expansion. And an organization like this one, built on the understanding that individual ambition stopped at the point where it threatened collective survival, had only one long-term response to a man who could not internalize that principle. In this business, the man who ruins the table for everyone else does not stay at the table for long. 6 a.m. Kings County Hospital. The surgery had been scheduled for dawn. Joey sat in a plastic chair in the hallway outside the operating room with his coat still on and his hands pressed flat on his knees. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner, and the particular staleness of a building that never fully darkens and never fully quiets. A nurse walked past without looking at him. A cart with metal instruments rattled somewhere around a corner, and the sound echoed off the tile walls and faded. He had not slept. He had not eaten since the previous morning. He had sat in this chair since 4 a.m., and he intended to stay in it until someone came through that door and told him something. At 8:47 a.m., a doctor in green scrubs came through the swinging doors and walked toward him. And Joey stood up from that chair so fast he knocked it back against the wall behind him. The surgery had been successful. Joey sat back down in the chair and put his face in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. The hallway continued around him. The cart rattled somewhere again. A telephone rang at the nurse's station and someone answered it in a low, professional voice. The world operated with its usual indifference, and inside that indifference Joey Caruso quietly came apart and quietly put himself back together in the space of about 4 minutes. He left New York 6 weeks later. No announcement. No goodbye to anyone who didn't need to know. He packed what fit into 2 suitcases and drove west with his wife in a car he paid cash for, and he did not look back at the skyline in the rearview mirror, because looking back at things you are leaving is a habit that belongs to people who still have the option of returning. He never took another contract. 2 years later, in 1959, Vito Genovese was convicted on federal narcotics charges and sentenced to 15 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Federal records confirm the conviction and the sentence. He died inside those walls in 1969, a man whose empire had been quietly redistributed among people who had never made the mistake of confusing personal ambition with organizational authority. Bumpy Johnson stayed in Harlem. He stayed because Harlem was his, and he had never needed to pretend otherwise. He ran his operation with the same measured discipline he had always applied to it. And the neighborhood remembered what he had done not because he advertised it, but because the people who had been there when it happened told their children, and their children told their children, and the story traveled the way stories travel in communities that have learned to keep their own history because nobody else is going to keep it for them. On July 7th, 1968, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to every person in Harlem as Bumpy, collapsed from heart failure in a restaurant on the west side of Manhattan. He was 62 years old. He died the way he had lived, in a room full of people, in a neighborhood that was his, doing exactly what he wanted to be doing. The federal files on Bumpy Johnson run to several hundred pages. They document arrests, investigations, suspected activities, known associates. What they do not document, what no federal file ever could, is the particular quality of the silence that fell over Harlem the morning the news spread that he was gone. That kind of silence doesn't get recorded in any official document. It lives in the people who stood in it, and it stays there until they are gone too. Some men get remembered because of what they took. Some men get remembered because of what they chose to give and because at the one moment that defined everything. They looked at the easier and more violent path and deliberately walked the other way instead. One night, one coffin, one recording, and the entire power structure of New York shifted without a single bullet fired. Bumpy Johnson didn't shoot Genovese. He did something that hurt far longer. He exposed him, in front of his own men, using his own words, in his own room. You can argue about what was on that recording. You can argue about who was standing where when the lid came open, but you cannot argue about what every man in Little Italy understood the morning after that someone had reached across this entire city and pulled the curtain down in front of an audience that could never unsee it. Harlem never changed hands. It never had to. This is not just a Mafia story. It is a story about power, patience, and the decision every person eventually faces: do you destroy, or do you control the outcome? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe, because what Bumpy Johnson did next is where it gets even darker. This story is presented for historical insight only, not to promote violence or illegal activity. Thank you for watching.